Here's what you may not know about the heirs of Walter P. Chrysler, the self-made mechanic who built one of America's great automotive empires. With the Chrysler name forever linked to cars, engines, and industry, you might expect his children to have followed him straight into the driver's seat of his business. But that's not what happened. Instead, each of his 4 children chose a different road, one that led away from the factory floor and into unexpected worlds of fashion art, philanthropy, and society. It's a surprising family story. The man who gave America the Chrysler Building and helped define the golden age of automobiles raised heirs who would leave their mark not by building cars, but by shaping culture. Rather than running the company, Walter Chrysler's children became icons in their own right and a celebrated figure in high society fashion. Another a collector who built a world-class art museum, and others who used their wealth and influence for quieter but lasting forms of philanthropy. How does a family go from the clanging workshops of Detroit to the glittering ballrooms of New York and the refined halls of art galleries? What does it mean when a titan of industry leaves behind not successors to his empire, but heirs who carry his name into completely different arenas? This is the little-known story of Walter P. Chrysler's 4 children: Thelma, Bernice, Walter Jr., and Jack. Their lives were filled with privilege and glamour, but also with choices that surprised many who assumed they would carry the family business forward. From lavish apartments on Park Avenue filled with Renoir and Degas to country estates decorated with French antiques to the creation of a museum that preserved treasures for future generations, the Chrysler legacy took on many forms. And it begins with Thelma Chrysler Foy, the eldest daughter who turned heads not in a boardroom but in the pages of fashion columns, earning a place among the best-dressed women in America. She also gave pieces of her art and furniture collections to the museum, ensuring that the treasures she amassed would educate and inspire the public. In her later years, she became known as an upper-crust society hostess, the kind of person who might organize charity galas or host artists and intellectuals in her salon. By all accounts, Thelma was vivacious, but also a perfectionist. One biographer noted she ran an impeccably tight ship at home, obsessing over every detail of decor and upkeep. There's even a story that as her health declined, she and her husband would spend evenings x-raying their fine china to ensure no piece had been secretly cracked or mended by the staff aesthete. That anecdote gives a glimpse of her intense dedication to preserving beauty, and perhaps the stress she lived under maintaining perfection in the public eye. Sadly, money and style were no shield against illness. In the 1950s, Thelma's charmed life was dealt a cruel blow. She was diagnosed with leukemia, a blood cancer difficult to treat at that time. Despite her frail health, she kept up appearances with trademark grace. In August 1957, Thelma Chrysler Foy passed away in Manhattan at the age of 55 after battling the disease. The news made the pages of Time magazine, which summed up her legacy as an upper-crust society hostess and patron of the arts, who had been repeatedly voted among the world's 10 best-dressed women. It was the end of an era for one of New York's grand dames. Number 3, Bernice Chrysler Garbish. Born in 1906, unlike her sister's very public persona, Bernice's path was a bit more low-key, yet deeply influential in its own way. If Thelma was the glittering socialite, Bernice became the quiet patron of American art and culture, largely outside of the spotlight. She inherited her father Walter's keen eye for quality, but applied it not to cars or couture, rather to preserving early American art that might otherwise have been forgotten. In 1930, Bernice married Colonel Edgar William Bill Garbish, a former Army football star turned businessman. The two made a striking pair. Edgar was athletic, accomplished, and shared Bernice's love of art. For over 50 years, they remained devoted partners in both marriage and collecting. Instead of New York City, Bernice and Edgar chose the tranquil life of Maryland's Eastern Shore. They settled on a sprawling country estate called Pokey Farms near Cambridge, Maryland. There, far from the bustle of Manhattan, they poured their energy into amassing one of the most extraordinary collections of American folk art in history. Over decades, the Garbishes scoured the country for 18th and 19th century American paintings, primitive portraits, landscapes, and antiques. They especially loved naive artworks by self-taught, often anonymous artists that captured early American life. By the 1970s, their collection had grown to over 2,600 paintings, considered the most comprehensive assemblage of American naive folk art ever put together. Imagine room after room filled with charming portraits of colonial farmers, vivid depictions of small-town scenes and rustic furniture and ceramics, a veritable time capsule of Americana. Bernice and Edgar didn't keep these treasures to themselves either. They generously shared them with the public. Throughout their lives, the couple donated hundreds of pieces to museums, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which became a primary home for many of their paintings. In fact, by the time they were in their 70s, the Garbishes had given so much to the National Gallery and other institutions that curators praised their generosity in preserving America's heritage. While Bernice lived largely out of the tabloids, she was every bit a society lady in her own elegant way. She maintained an apartment in New York, decorated by the same interior designer her sister used, ensuring a refined Tusha status lamp, blogpot.com, and she supported the arts quietly. Friends described Bernice as gracious, thoughtful, and keenly intelligent, someone who found joy in curating beauty rather than being celebrated for it. She did not seek the limelight, but the art world certainly knew and respected her and Edgar for their discerning eye. In 1979, the couple decided to auction off some remaining furnishings and antiques from Pokey Farms, and it became a high-profile event, a lavish party at their estate, as the Washington Post called it. Collectors and socialites flocked to see the legendary collection in the home where it had lived. By then, however, the walls were mostly bare. The priceless folk paintings that once hung there had already been sent off to museums for safekeeping. This was Bernice's quiet mission, to make sure that pieces of American history would survive beyond her, accessible to everyone. Fate, in the end, wrote a remarkable final chapter for Bernice and Edgar. After more than 5 decades of marriage, the two truly could not live without each other. In December 1979, at ages 73 and 80 respectively, Bernice Chrysler Garbish and her husband died. Within hours of each other, literally on the same day, Edgar passed away first, on December 13, 1979, in the evening, and Bernice followed early the next morning on December 14th. Their passing was front-page news and art circles, a poignant end to a lifetime partnership. It was as if neither wished to continue alone. They were buried together in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, New York, in the Chrysler family plot. While Bernice's name may not be widely known to the public, her impact endures in the art world. Walk into the National Gallery of Art today, and you can find folk paintings with labels crediting the Garbish collection. Gifts from Bernice and Edgar that enrich our understanding of American art. Number 2. Walter P. Chrysler Jr. Born in 1909, Walter Jr. was groomed from birth to follow in his father's formidable footsteps, or so Walter Sr. hoped. As a child, Walt Jr. enjoyed all the privileges money could buy. He attended elite prep schools and even hobnobbed with other wealthy heirs. At Dartmouth College, he befriended Nelson Rockefeller and co-founded an arts magazine instead of studying business. This was an early hint. Walter Jr.'s heart belonged not to engines, but to art. While he loved his father, he didn't share Walter Sr.'s single-minded passion for the car industry. Imagine the pressure on this young man. He bore the name Walter Chrysler Jr., with everyone assuming he'd someday run Chrysler Corporation. But behind the scenes, the younger Walter was a sensitive, creative soul, more at home in an art gallery than a boardroom. That's not to say he didn't try the corporate route. Walter Sr. was determined to involve his son in the family empire. He famously set up tests and roles for Walter Jr., even challenging him to literally work his way from the bottom of the Chrysler building to the top executive suite. In 1934, at just 25, Walter Jr. was put in charge of a new division of Chrysler called Air Temp, which developed the first automotive air conditioning system. Under his nominal leadership, Air Temp did invent an innovative car air conditioner, a point of pride for the company. The next year, Walter Sr. made his son president of the company that managed the Chrysler building, the skyscraper his father had built for the family. It was a prestigious title, president of the W.P. Chrysler Building Corp., and he held that position until 1953. From the outside, it looked like Walter Jr. was being primed as an industrial leader. But the reality was more complicated. Insiders whispered that Walter Jr.'s executive roles were largely figurehead positions created by his father to keep him occupied. Walter Sr., a shrewd judge of talent, likely realized that his son didn't have the enthusiasm for running an auto company. In fact, some say the elder Chrysler kept Walter Jr. on a short leash in those jobs to ensure no harm was done. The younger Walter's mind simply drifted elsewhere to paintings, plays, and parties whenever he was supposed to focus on business. Finally, in the mid-1950s, Walter Jr. made a bold choice. He effectively walked away from the corporate world. In 1956, at age 47, he retired from active business life entirely to devote himself to the arts. By then, his father had been gone for years. Walter Sr. died in 1940, and the Chrysler Corporation was being led by professional managers. Walter Jr. saw his chance to pursue his true passion, and pursue it he did, with remarkable energy and vision. Over the decades, he had quietly built up a personal art collection that was nothing short of astonishing. He started collecting art as a teenager, famously buying a small Renoir watercolor, while still in prep school, only to have a prudish dorm master destroy it because it had a nude figure. Undeterred, young Walter kept collecting. In the 1930s, he traveled Europe, meeting modern masters like Picasso, Matisse, and Edgar, and purchasing their works directly. He amassed paintings by avant-garde European artists and significant American painters alike. But painting wasn't his only interest. Walter Jr. became enthralled by glass art and other decorative arts. Over the years, he acquired an 8,000-piece collection of glass, including exquisite art, Nouveau glass lamps, Tiffany glass from his Long Island neighbor, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and antique American glass works. His estate overflowed with everything from old master paintings to Roman antiquities to contemporary art. It was as if he wanted to collect the whole world of art under one roof. Friends joked that Walter's appetite for art was limitless. If he fancied something and could afford it, and he could, he'd add it to his trove. Walter Jr. also dabbled in show business and culture in ways that surprised those who knew him only as an auto heir. For example, he was an early supporter of the fledgling Museum of Modern Art in New York, even serving as the first chairman of MoMA's library committee and donating materials on Dada and Surrealism. He also produced Broadway shows, notably the 1952 revue New Faces, which helped launch the careers of entertainer Kit and comedian Mel Brooks. He even produced a Hollywood film in 1953, The Joe Louis Story about the famous boxer. Walter Jr. was in essence a Renaissance man with fingers in many artistic pies. Yet despite this fulfilling life, one senses he still carried the weight of the Chrysler name and the question of legacy. He had no children of his own. We'll get to that shortly. And as the years passed, he must have wondered, what would he leave behind? Then in the late 1950s, fate dealt some heavy blows that profoundly shaped Walter Jr.'s mission. Tragedy struck the Chrysler family in quick succession. In 1957, his beloved sister Thelma, the chic socialite we met earlier, died of leukemia at just 55. Walter Jr. was very close to Thelma. Her death shook him deeply. And barely a year later, in 1958, his younger brother Jack died suddenly of a heart attack at only 46. Within 1 year, Walter Jr. found himself the last surviving son of Walter P. Chrysler, the sole male heir to carry on the family's name. It was a moment of reckoning. Friends say Walter Jr. became intensely reflective after losing 2 siblings so rapidly. Issues of mortality and legacy loomed large for him. He may not have wanted to run the car company, but he still cared deeply about the Chrysler legacy and name. Who would remember the Chryslers in 50 or 100 years? And for what these questions burned in his mind? Walter Jr. found his answer in the very passion that had always guided him: art. In 1958, the same year his brother passed, Walter took a bold step to create a lasting legacy. He decided to transform his private collection into a public museum. He purchased a former church in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a charming coastal art colony, and hastily converted it into the Chrysler Art Museum, opening its doors in July 1958. Picture it: a wealthy heir turning a little New England church into a showcase for Picasso's Matisses and Tiffany glass. It was eccentric, perhaps, but deeply meaningful to Walter. This was his personal monument to carry the family name forward in a way that felt authentic to him. He poured his money into it, even selling the original Chrysler building, which the family had owned, and his Long Island estate to fund his museum ambitions. The Provincetown Museum was a gem, but it had its issues. It was small and somewhat remote, unable to display Walter's entire enormous collection. By the late 1960s, he was searching for a more suitable, larger home for his art. Enter the city of Norfolk, Virginia. With the help of his second wife, who hailed from Norfolk, and an eager local government, Walter Jr. struck a deal to move his collection to the Norfolk Museum of Arts and Sciences, which would be renamed the Chrysler Museum of Art in his honor. In 1971, he packed up thousands of artworks and relocated them to Norfolk, effectively gifting the bulk of his collection to that city. This move cemented his legacy. Today, the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk is considered one of the finest regional art museums in the United States, housing over 30,000 objects, all because of Walter Jr.'s vision. The museum became the new custodian of the Chrysler name, not in automobiles, but in art and education. Walter Jr. spent his later years in Norfolk closely involved with the museum and delighted to see crowds enjoying the art he had collected over a lifetime. In an interview, he expressed joy that the collection was transforming lives and bringing art and people together, precisely what he had hoped for. Now, on the personal front, Walter Jr.'s life was also unconventional. He married twice, but had no children. His first marriage was to Marguerite Peggy Sykes, a Manhattan socialite, in 1938. Society pages buzzed about the Chrysler heir and the beautiful debutante. However, the marriage was unhappy and very short-lived. They divorced in 1939, barely a year and a half later. Years later, it came out that Walter Jr. may have been grappling with his sexual orientation, which could explain the marriage's failure. LisaRoll.com, but at the time, details were kept private. All anyone knew was that the two had grown apart. During World War II, Walter Jr. served in the U.S. Navy as an aviation officer, and it was in the Navy town of Norfolk that he met his second wife, Jean Esther Outland. Jean was a Southern woman with a passion for the arts that matched Walter's. They married in 1945 and were a devoted couple for nearly 37 years. Jean shared Walter's dream of the museum and was instrumental in convincing him to choose Norfolk as its location. They lived on a serene farm estate in Virginia, breeding Race horses and even purebred Chihuahua for fun. Although they never had children, Walter and Jean were very happy together. Jean sadly passed away in 1982 at the age of 60, which was a heavy blow to Walter. But he kept going, driven by the museum project that they had nurtured together. In September 1988, Walter P. Chrysler Jr. passed away in Norfolk at the age of 79 after a long struggle with cancer. He was laid to rest in the family mausoleum in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery alongside his wife Jean and near his parents. His death made national news. The New York Times memorialized him as a major collector of modern art and artifacts, noting that his multi-million-dollar collection formed the core of the Chrysler Museum. Importantly, upon his death, Walter Jr. bequeathed the majority of the remaining Chrysler family trust, 3 acres of it, to endow the museum. This generous act ensured that the Chrysler Museum of Art would thrive and grow long after he was gone, which it certainly has. Today, if you visit the museum in Norfolk, free to the public as Walter wanted, you'll not only see an incredible array of art, but you'll also be standing in the legacy of a man who chose paintings over pistons. Number 1. John Jack Chrysler. Born in 1912, Jack was the baby of the family, and he often gets the least attention in retellings, perhaps because his life lacked the flash of his siblings. But Jack's story is still a key part of the puzzle. In many ways, he was the most straightforward of the Chrysler children. A man who actually liked the business world, stayed largely out of scandal, and tried to contribute in his own low-key fashion. Jack was only 28 when his father died in 1940. And unlike Walter Jr., he did show interest in the automobile business, at least initially. In the early 1930s, Walter Sr. had Jack apprentice as a machinist in a Chrysler factory at age 22. This hands-on training from the shop floor up was classic Walter Sr. He wanted his sons to understand the products and the workers if they were ever to lead the company. Jack embraced the opportunity. He earned a reputation among those who knew him as more down-to-earth and business-savvy than his artistic older brother. While Walter Jr. was hosting champagne art salons at Dartmouth, Jack was learning the nuts and bolts literally of car manufacturing. Over time, Jack did make a solid mark within Chrysler Corporation, not as a top executive, but as a capable figure in the corporate ecosystem. After World War II, Jack broadened his business endeavors. He partnered with one of his father's associates to found a venture capital company aiming to invest in new enterprises. This was quite forward-thinking. Venture capital was not a common term back then. Jack clearly inherited some entrepreneurial spark from his dad. He also became a financial broker, securing coveted seats on both the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange. That was a big deal. Those exchange seats were prestigious and not easy to get, indicating Jack was an accomplished financier. Through the 1940s and 1950s, he toggled between roles in manufacturing and finance. At one point, he even helped manage a Chrysler sales region and learned the ropes of the auto market. But ultimately, Jack did not rise to helm Chrysler Corporation. After Walter Sr.'s death, professional managers like CEO K.T. Keller ran the company. Neither Walter Jr. nor Jack ended up leading the firm, a point which surely would have surprised observers in 1920. When we hear the name Chrysler, we immediately think of the gleaming automobiles that once defined an era of Detroit's roaring factories and of the famous Chrysler building rising proudly above the Manhattan skyline. These images all trace back to one man, Walter P. Chrysler, the immigrant's son, turned railroad mechanic, who through ambition and sheer determination rose to create one of America's great automotive empires. His story is often told as the triumph of industry and vision. But what about the stories that came after his? What about the children who carried the Chrysler name into a new generation? For Thelma Bernice Walter Jr. and John Jack Chrysler, life unfolded under the immense weight of a legacy that was larger than any one of them could ever fully grasp. They grew up in a world their father could only have dreamed of as a young man: lavish mansions, private tutors, glittering balls, and the privileges of New York's high society. Yet privilege never meant immunity from pain, and wealth did not shield them from tragedy. Each child took a path far different from the one the world might have expected. Instead of stepping into the auto plants and boardrooms of Detroit, they charted their own directions. Thelma became a high society fashion icon and a patron of the arts. Walter Jr. dedicated himself to culture, eventually founding the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia. Bernice preferred a quieter role tied to family and philanthropy. And Jack, the youngest son, chose an understated life, pursuing his own business interests, sailing on weekends, and building a family away from the relentless glare of the press. By the mid-20th century, it was clear that the Chrysler empire would not be carried on directly by Walter's sons. The heirs chose different passions, reflecting the reality that being born into a fortune does not guarantee a destiny of leadership. Their lives were punctuated by glamour and privilege, but also marked by heartbreaks that mirrored the fragility of any family. Deaths came too soon. The family tree, though rooted in wealth and achievement, was also scarred by loss. Among these stories, Jack Chrysler's stands out not because it was filled with drama or scandal, but because of its quiet dignity. In many ways, Jack was the most relatable of Walter's children. He wasn't a headline name in the gossip pages, nor a flamboyant figure in high society. He was known instead for his modesty, for his love of sailing, for his steady devotion to family. He married Edith Helen Bacchus in 1941, building a life that gave Walter and Della Chrysler more grandchildren to adore. He pursued business ventures in New York, blending easily into the city's financial and social circles, though never chasing the spotlight. And yet, just as his life seemed comfortably settled, tragedy struck. On November 7th, 1958, Jack Chrysler died suddenly of a heart attack in New York at only 46 years old. By all accounts, he had been healthy and active, making the loss all the more devastating. His death came barely a year after his sister Thelma's passing, compounding the grief for a family that had already endured so much. For his wife and children, it was the unimaginable loss of a husband and father. For his brother Walter Jr., it was a galvanizing moment, leaving him as the last surviving Chrysler son and spurring him to solidify his own legacy through art and philanthropy. The story of Walter P. Chrysler's children reminds us of something powerful, that legacies are not always carried through boardrooms or corporations. Sometimes they unfold in unexpected ways through the fashion world, through art collections, through philanthropy, and through the quieter choices of those who preferred to live away from the headlines. The Chrysler heirs were not carbon copies of their father. They were individuals shaped by privilege but also by sorrow, each navigating the towering shadow of a name that once defined an empire. This is their story.